Two men are watching Jesus from the edge of a crowd in Jerusalem, close enough to hear him, careful not to be seen listening too closely. One wears the fringed robe of a Pharisee. The other stands a little apart. Herod's man, a Herodian, the kind of Jew who dines with Roman officials and keeps his opinions about the Tetrarch to himself. A week earlier, these two men would not have shared a meal. Their groups disagree on almost everything: taxes, purity, whether a Jew should serve in Herod's court at all. But today, they are standing shoulder to shoulder, and in a few verses, Mark will tell us they've started planning something together. Not a debate, not a rebuttal, a plot. Two rival factions, suddenly aligned, watching the same man. The text never explains what finally brought them into the same room. It doesn't have to. Something about this one rabbi from Nazareth was making enemies out of people who couldn't stand each other, and somehow only he could unite them. That single strange alliance is where this story actually begins. Because Jesus wasn't opposed by the religious leaders as one group with one grievance. He was opposed by several groups who barely agreed on anything until he showed up. To understand why that alliance was so strange, you have to understand the room they were standing in. Not just the temple courts, but the entire fractured world pressing in around them. This is Judea, somewhere in the early 1st century. Rome has been in charge here for decades, since a general named Pompey marched into Jerusalem nearly 100 years earlier and never really left. By the time Jesus is walking through these same streets, the arrangement has shifted, but the core fact hasn't. This land answers to Caesar. Judea itself is governed by a Roman prefect. Up north, in Galilee, a different kind of ruler holds power. Herod Antipas, a tetrarch, not a king, a man whose authority exists only because Rome allows it and can revoke it. Everyone in this world knows the difference between a throne you inherit and a throne you're loaned. Antipas never forgets it, neither does anyone watching him. Into this arrangement, try to imagine holding on to your community's religious identity as a Jewish person, not privately, not abstractly, practically. Every group answering that question is answering it differently. There are Pharisees, a lay movement built around the conviction that if Israel is going to belong to God, ordinary daily life has to be shaped by that belonging, not just what happens inside the temple, but what happens at your table, in your home, in how you wash your hands before a meal. Their name likely comes from a Hebrew root meaning something close to separated ones, though scholars differ on exactly what that separation was originally understood to mean. They are not the priestly elite. Many are teachers, tradesmen, synagogue leaders, scattered across towns, like the ones Jesus preaches in. Their influence isn't institutional, it's personal, local, and by most historical accounts, genuinely popular among ordinary Jewish people trying to live faithfully under foreign occupation. Then there's another group holding a very different kind of power. The Sadducees are not a grassroots movement. They are drawn from priestly and aristocratic families, the ones with names attached to the temple's daily operations, the sacrifices, the treasury, the machinery that keeps Jerusalem's religious economy running. Many scholars trace their name back to Zadok, the priest from Solomon's era, though even that connection is treated as likely rather than certain. Their authority isn't built on popular teaching, it's built on office, and their theology, in some of the most fundamental places, doesn't match the Pharisees at all. Where Pharisees affirm resurrection, angels, an unseen world still unfolding, Sadducees don't. Two groups, both claiming to represent faithful Judaism, disagreeing about what happens after you die. Standing near both of them, sometimes serving one, sometimes the other, are the scribes. Not a sect exactly, a profession. The trained, legal, and textual specialists of this world, the ones who can read and interpret the case law built up around Torah. When someone needs a document drafted or a legal question settled, a scribe is who they call. Their authority comes from expertise, not popularity or priesthood. Then there's the group standing at the edge of this picture, the one that doesn't fit the word religious as neatly as the others, the Herodians. Not a sect built on scripture or interpretation. A faction built on proximity to power, Jews who have made their peace with Rome's client king, who benefit from that arrangement, who have every reason to want the current order to hold steady. Pharisees generally regard this kind of comfortable accommodation with real suspicion, which is exactly why, later, finding Herodians and Pharisees standing together will feel like watching oil and water refuse to separate. Overseeing all of it, at least in Jerusalem, sits the Sanhedrin, the council of chief priests, elders, and scribes, with authority over Jewish religious and legal matters, operating under Rome's watchful permission. At the head of that council, during this period, a high priest named Caiaphas, a man who did not inherit his office through some unbroken sacred line, but who was appointed to it by a Roman governor, and who understood, better than almost anyone else in this story, exactly how easily Rome could take that appointment away again. This is the world Jesus steps into, not one religious establishment with one grievance against him, a crowded, competitive, uneasy coalition of groups who spend most of their energy disagreeing with each other about theology, about power, about how close to get to Rome and how far to stay from it. Into the middle of all of it walks a rabbi with no formal scribal training, no priestly lineage, no political office, teaching with an authority none of these groups granted him, gathering crowds none of them controlled. Mark's Gospel records the first time this tension breaks into the open. Not in Jerusalem yet, in a synagogue, on a Sabbath, over something as small as a withered hand. Picture the room. A man is present with a withered hand, likely a Sabbath regular, someone the community has watched struggle for years. And in the room, watching Jesus rather than the man, are Pharisees. Mark tells us plainly what they're doing there. They watched him, whether he would heal him on the Sabbath day, that they might accuse him. Notice what's actually happening in that sentence. They aren't there to see if healing is possible. They already know it is. They're there to see if Jesus will do it on this particular day, because if he does, they have grounds for an accusation. Jesus doesn't wait for them to raise the objection. He raises it himself. Is it lawful to do good on the Sabbath days, or to do evil? To save life, or to kill? And the room goes silent. Not because the question is unanswerable, but because everyone already knows the answer, and saying it out loud exposes what's really being protected. This isn't a debate about whether healing matters. It's a debate about who gets to define what the Sabbath is for. The Pharisaic movement exists to make Torah livable in daily life, to build a fence around holy days so nothing accidentally violates them. That instinct isn't cynical. It comes from real reverence for the command. But reverence for a boundary can slowly turn into something else, a system where protecting the rule becomes more urgent than the reason the rule existed in the first place. Think of a homeowner who installs a security system to protect a family, and years later refuses to let the family back inside because it might trip the alarm. The system was never supposed to outrank the people it was built to protect. That's the tension in this synagogue, not healing versus law, a law meant to serve life, being used, in this moment, to withhold it. Mark records something easy to skim past. Jesus is angry, grieved, for the hardness of their hearts, genuine emotion, aimed not at the rule itself, but at what protecting the rule had done to the people enforcing it. He heals the man anyway, and the very next verse is the one this documentary already opened with. The Pharisees walk out and start plotting with the Herodians, but that raises an obvious problem. A Sabbath dispute explains why Pharisees might be upset. It does not explain why Herodians, a group with no real stake in Sabbath law, would care at all. Something else is going on beneath the surface of this specific fight. To find it, we have to look at a second confrontation, one that reveals what the Pharisees were actually protecting when they used the word unclean. Later, in Mark 7, a delegation arrives from Jerusalem, scribes and Pharisees, sent specifically to observe. They notice something. Some of Jesus' disciples are eating without ceremonially washing their hands first, and they ask him directly, "Why walk not thy disciples according to the tradition of the elders, but eat bread with unwashen hands?" This has nothing to do with hygiene. In this cultural context, hand-washing before meals wasn't a health practice. It was a ritual purity practice, an extension of priestly temple regulations into ordinary household life. It isn't commanded anywhere in Torah. It's called, explicitly, the tradition of the elders, a layer of interpretation built on top of the written law, not the law itself. So when the Pharisees ask their question, they aren't really asking why the disciples don't wash their hands. They're asking why this movement won't submit to their system of interpretation. Jesus' answer goes straight at that distinction. He quotes Isaiah, "This people honoreth me with their lips, but their heart is far from me," teaching for doctrines the commandments of men, and then states the contrast plainly. Ye lay aside the commandment of God and hold the tradition of men. Not God's law versus no law, human tradition elevated to the authority of God's law, mistaken for the same thing. It would be easy to hear this and think Jesus is dismissing tradition altogether. He isn't. The confrontation is specifically about a tradition being placed on equal footing with command, about the fence around the field being treated as though it were the field itself. This is where the purity motive comes fully into focus. The Pharisaic movement's entire source of authority, their influence in synagogues, their standing among ordinary people, rested on being the recognized interpreters of how Torah applies to daily life. If Jesus can simply set that interpretive authority aside, teaching as one having authority and not as the scribes, then the very thing that made Pharisees Pharisees is no longer the only path to faithfulness. That's not a small threat. That's the ground shifting under an entire system of religious identity. That's the piece most people never catch, that the hand-washing dispute was never really about hands at all. It was about who gets to decide what faithfulness looks like. Once you see that, you start noticing it everywhere in these confrontations, that the surface issue is almost never the real issue. If you're starting to notice that pattern too, that most of these conflicts have a hidden layer underneath the obvious one, that's exactly the kind of reading this channel is built around. If that's new to you, consider staying for the rest of this, and subscribing if you want more of Scripture unpacked this way. Because purity still doesn't explain the Herodians. Their fingerprints are on this story from the first confrontation, and their motive isn't theological at all. Roll forward to Jerusalem, later in the story. A group approaches Jesus with what sounds, on the surface, like flattery. "Master, we know that thou art true, and teachest the way of God in truth, neither carest thou for any man." Then, the actual question, is it lawful to give tribute to Caesar or not? Matthew tells us plainly who sent them. Pharisees, this time working alongside Herodians, the same odd pairing from the synagogue, back again, and for good reason. This question isn't really about tax policy, it's a trap, built with two working blades. If Jesus says yes, pay the tax, he alienates every ordinary Jew who resents funding the occupying army that governs their land. If he says no, don't pay it, he has just handed the Herodians and the Roman authorities they answer to a case for treason, spoken in public, in front of witnesses. There is no safe answer inside that question. That's the point of it. Jesus asks for a coin. A denarius stamped with Caesar's image and an inscription identifying him, essentially, as a son of a god. Devout Jews already found carrying that coin uncomfortable, a graven image moving through their pockets, making a theological claim every time it changed hands. Jesus asks whose image is on it. They answer. And he gives them the line that ends the trap. Render unto Caesar the things which are Caesar's, and unto God the things that are God's. Notice what the answer actually does. It doesn't dodge the question, it reframes it. Caesar's image is on the coin, so give Caesar the coin. But whose image is on you? That question sits underneath the famous line, unspoken but unmistakable to anyone standing there who knew the opening chapters of their own scripture, where humanity is described as bearing the image of God. For the Herodians specifically, this moment reveals exactly what they were protecting, not doctrine, not purity, position. Their entire social standing depended on a stable, cooperative relationship with Rome through Herod's court, a popular teacher capable of either inciting a tax revolt or getting arrested as a revolutionary threatened that stability either way. Their opposition to Jesus was never about whether he honored God correctly. It was about whether he was safe to have around. That's the piece the Sabbath story couldn't explain on its own. The Herodians didn't walk out of that synagogue offended by theology. They walked out calculating risk. And it's worth noticing how differently the two allied groups needed Jesus stopped. The Pharisees needed him wrong. The Herodians simply needed him gone. But there's a third motive still sitting mostly in the background, visible in small, easy-to-miss details scattered through these same confrontations, and it belongs to a group that isn't a sect at all, but a profession standing inside almost every other group in this story. The scribes rarely appear as a confrontation on their own. They show up alongside Pharisees in the hand-washing dispute, alongside chief priests in the trial narratives, woven into nearly every faction, because their skill, reading and interpreting the law, was needed by all of them. But Jesus does eventually turn his attention to something specific about how scribes carried themselves, and it has nothing to do with legal expertise. Beware of the scribes, which love to go in long clothing, and love salutations in the marketplaces, and the chief seats in the synagogues, and the uppermost rooms at feasts. Watch the pattern in that sentence. Not, beware of the scribes, who teach false doctrine. Beware of the scribes, who love to be noticed. Matthew's Gospel expands the same portrait onto the Pharisees, describing broadened phylacteries and enlarged borders on garments, worn visibly, along with a fondness for the best seats and for being greeted with honorific titles in public. These aren't small vanities in this culture. Phylacteries, small boxes containing scripture worn during prayer, and tassels on garments were genuinely commanded religious practices. The issue was never wearing them. The issue was wearing them larger, more visibly, in a way clearly designed to be seen and admired rather than simply obeyed. 7 times in a row, Matthew 23 repeats a single word aimed at this pattern. Woe unto you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites. The Greek term behind that word, hypokrites, carried a theatrical sense in Greek usage, referring to an actor performing a role behind a mask. Whether Jesus intends that specific theatrical image or is simply using the word in its broader first-century sense of a pretender, scholars differ. Either sense fits what's being described. A performance of devotion, staged for an audience, increasingly distant from the actual condition of the heart behind it. This is the fourth motive sitting quietly underneath everything else in this story. Not purity, not power, not political survival, status, the simple, deeply human desire to be seen as important, to occupy the best seat, to be greeted with the right title in the marketplace. And it's worth noticing how ordinary that desire is. It doesn't require corruption or cruelty. It only requires enough years of public religious life for the performance to start feeling more natural than the substance underneath it. 4 groups now. 4 different things being protected. Purity, guarded by Pharisees who feared losing their role as interpreters of faithful living. Politics, guarded by Herodians who feared losing a fragile peace with Rome. Status, guarded by scribes who feared losing their visible place of honor. And one motive left, the deepest and most consequential of all, belonging to the group with the most institutional power in Jerusalem and the most to lose if that power ever slipped. Here's a detail worth slowing all the way down for. When Jesus walks into the temple courts and starts overturning tables, Mark doesn't just record the action. He records what Jesus says while he's doing it, and it isn't spontaneous outrage, it's a quotation. 2 quotations actually, stitched together. Is it not written, My house shall be called of all nations the house of prayer, but ye have made it a den of thieves? Start with the first half. My house shall be called. The house of prayer comes from Isaiah 56, and it's worth knowing what that passage is actually about in its original setting. Isaiah 56 isn't a generic statement about worship. It's specifically about foreigners and outsiders being welcomed into God's house, told explicitly that they will not be shut out. Jesus is quoting a promise about the temple's purpose being inclusion, a house of prayer for all nations, not just Israel. Now the second half, den of thieves, comes from Jeremiah 7, and this one has an edge that's easy to miss if you don't know where it's from. Jeremiah 7 is a courtroom speech. God, through the prophet, confronts people who are showing up at the temple, performing the right rituals, repeating the temple of the Lord like a slogan, while outside the temple walls, oppressing the vulnerable and trusting in the building itself rather than in faithfulness to God. Jeremiah's point is that the temple had become a hiding place for people who wanted the appearance of security without the substance of righteousness. A den, not where thieves commit the crime, but where they retreat to feel safe after committing it elsewhere. Look at what Jesus has actually done. He hasn't invented a new critique. He has taken two prophetic texts, one about who the temple should welcome, one about what the temple had become, and pointed them directly at the institution standing in front of him. And this isn't the first time in Israel's story that a corrupt priesthood gets confronted for exactly this pattern, using access to God's house as a shield rather than a service. Centuries earlier, the sons of Eli abused their priestly position at the tabernacle, treating sacred offerings as personal privilege, and judgment fell on their house because of it. Centuries after that, the prophet Malachi confronted a priesthood grown careless with what was holy, offering God leftovers instead of the best of what they had. Different centuries, different specific failures, same underlying shape, priestly power, meant to mediate access to God, curdling into self-protection and self-interest. Jesus isn't inventing a grievance against the temple establishment. He's standing in a long prophetic line, confronting exactly this pattern with Israel's own words. Which means the chief priests and elders who hear this, and who go on, just a few verses later, to demand, "By what authority doest thou these things?" are asking the wrong question without realizing it. They're asking where Jesus' authority comes from, as though it's a credential he's missing. But the words he just used weren't his own invention requiring a new credential. They were Israel's own prophetic tradition, the very tradition their own scriptures preserved, spoken back to them in their own courtyard. That's the moment the power motive stops being abstract. This isn't simply the Sadducees didn't like Jesus. The institution built to mediate access to God is being confronted, using its own sacred texts, for having become a place people hide rather than a place people meet God. And the ones most invested in that institution's continued function felt it most sharply. John's Gospel later records the chief priests and Pharisees convening the council and stating their fear outright, not in theological language, but in political terms. "If we let him thus alone, all men will believe on him, and the Romans shall come and take away both our place and nation." Their opposition, at least here, is explicitly about institutional survival under Roman occupation, not doctrine. Purity was the Pharisees' fault line. Politics was the Herodians. Status belonged to the scribes. Power, institutional and temple-centered, belonged to the Sadducees and the chief priests. And it isn't a new fault line in Israel's story. It's one of the oldest ones in the book. Step back now. Let the details settle. Look at the whole shape of it. A man with a withered hand, standing in a synagogue that had made room for the rule but forgotten the man attached to it. A delegation from Jerusalem, more concerned with unwashed hands than an unhealed heart. A coin passed between hands, carrying a question no one wanted to answer honestly. Long robes and wide phylacteries, worn for an audience. A courtyard full of overturned tables, and a quotation from Israel's own prophets thrown back at the men who thought they owned the building. Different rooms, different accusations, different people entirely. Pharisees, guarding purity. Herodians, guarding political position. Scribes, guarding visible status. Chief priests and Sadducees, guarding institutional power. Each one certain they were protecting something sacred. Each one, in their own way, right about that, and each one, in their own way, protecting it in a manner that had quietly become more important than the God it was meant to serve. That's the pattern underneath every confrontation in this story. Not one enemy, not one grievance, A crowded field of institutions, most of them suspicious of each other, most of them unwilling to sit at the same table, until one man made them feel, for entirely different reasons, that something they valued was at risk. The Pharisee did not fear what the Sadducee feared. The Sadducee did not fear what the Herodian feared. But they all, eventually, found themselves standing in the same place, watching the same man, asking some version of the same question: what do we do about him? This is where it stops being ancient history and starts being uncomfortably familiar. None of these groups thought of themselves as the villain of this story. They thought of themselves as the ones holding the line, protecting the Sabbath, the temple, the tradition, the fragile peace with Rome. Every one of them believed they were being faithful. That's what makes this pattern so hard to look away from. It was never really about religion versus irreligion. It was about proximity to something people had built their identity around: purity, power, position, status, and what happens when that thing feels threatened. But before we get to the one group Jesus welcomed instead of confronted, sit with the ones he didn't a moment longer. Because something about their fear is not as distant as it first appears. None of them woke up that morning deciding to oppose God. The Pharisee who watched a withered hand instead of the man attached to it wasn't indifferent to suffering. He was protecting something he believed mattered, a boundary he genuinely thought kept his people faithful. The priest, weighing the temple's risk against Rome, wasn't cynical about God. He was afraid of losing the one structure that had, for his entire life, made God feel reachable, present, secure. That fear is not unfamiliar. Most people don't defend something because they've stopped believing in it. They defend it because they're afraid of what happens if it goes away. There's a version of that fear in almost every life, the tradition kept, because letting it go feels like losing the version of yourself that tradition built. The certainty held on to a little too tightly, not out of pride, but because uncertainty feels like standing on nothing. The role, the reputation, the way things have always been done, held on to, not out of malice, but out of the quiet, reasonable fear that if this changes, something essential about who we are changes with it. That's what makes this story less a portrait of villains and more a portrait of people. People who loved God in their own way and were still capable of missing him when he stood right in front of them, because he didn't arrive wearing the shape they were watching for. It raises a question worth sitting with honestly, rather than answering too quickly. How much of what we call faithfulness is actually about God, and how much of it is about the safety of the structure we've built around him? The text doesn't offer 3 steps to avoid becoming a Pharisee or a chief priest. What it offers is quieter than that, a picture of people so committed to protecting what they knew of God that they nearly missed God himself. And an invitation, underneath all of it, to ask whether what we're protecting is actually him, or just the room we built to keep him in. Now turn toward the one group in this story that never received a single confrontation like the ones we've just walked through. A group everyone else in this story would have crossed the road to avoid. Samaritans and Jews shared a long, bitter history by the time Jesus arrives on the scene, rooted in old disputes over the legitimate place of worship and generations of mutual suspicion. John's Gospel states the social reality plainly, almost in passing. Jews have no dealings with the Samaritans. That single line carries the weight of centuries, so it means something that when Jesus travels through Samaria and stops at a well near noon, tired from the road, and a Samaritan woman comes to draw water, he speaks to her at all. Their conversation, recorded in John 4, runs longer than almost any other one-on-one exchange Jesus has with a single person anywhere in the Gospels, longer than most of his dialogues with Pharisees, longer than his exchange with Nicodemus, a respected teacher of Israel. He speaks to her about living water, about worship in spirit and in truth, about her own life, honestly and without shaming her into silence. And she leaves that conversation to tell her entire town about him. There's no trap in that exchange, no accusation, no demand for a sign. Just a real conversation offered to someone every other group in this documentary would have avoided speaking to in public. The pattern continues elsewhere. When Jesus tells a story to illustrate what it means to love a neighbor, the hero he chooses is not a priest, not a Levite, both of whom pass by a wounded man on the road. The hero is a Samaritan, the one figure in the story his original audience would have least expected to be commended. And when 10 lepers are healed on the road to Jerusalem, only one returns to give thanks. Luke notes, almost quietly, that he was a Samaritan. There's one more moment worth sitting with, because it flips the entire confrontation pattern on its head. When a Samaritan village refuses to welcome Jesus, James and John ask whether they should call down fire from heaven to destroy it. Jesus does not aim confrontation at the Samaritans in that moment. He turns and rebukes his own disciples instead. Put all of that beside everything we've just walked through. Pharisees, confronted over purity. Sadducees and chief priests, confronted over power. Herodians, confronted over political self-interest. Scribes, confronted over status. And Samaritans, socially the most excluded group in this entire story, given welcome, dignity, and the longest theological conversation in the Gospels. That asymmetry is the detail worth carrying out of this video. Confrontation, in this story, was never really about which category someone belonged to. It was about posture. Every group Jesus confronted was, in some way, protecting itself. The one group he welcomed instead had nothing left to protect. No purity system to defend, no temple office to preserve, no political standing to secure, no status to guard. Just an honest need, met honestly. The Pharisee protected purity. The Sadducee protected power. The Herodian protected his position. The scribe protected his seat. And the one group Jesus never had to protect himself from was the one everyone else had already decided didn't belong in the room. Maybe the real danger was never disbelief. Maybe it was belief that had learned to protect itself instead of him. If this changed the way you'll read these confrontations, that's what this channel exists for, sitting with Scripture long enough to see what's actually there. If it helped, consider subscribing to the Scripture Project. And if someone in your life needs to see this story a little differently, send it their way. Thank you for being here.